Good morning. It's good to see you this morning. Thanks for being here. This picture, first slide that you're going to see, is a picture of a wall. But it's a wall that's been broken down. It's a wall that's been infiltrated. And I think that all of us at some point of our lives can relate to that. Maybe some of you are going through that right now, that this wall that you had up, this source of protection, this thing that caused you to breathe easy when you laid your head on your pillow at night, something has happened. Something has gotten through it, and you've experienced loss of some kind, whether that's relationship loss, job loss, health loss, whatever it may be. Keep this image in mind because we're just going to keep coming back to it over and over. Tim Keller's book, Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering, is a difficult but very important read. And in it, toward the end of each chapter, he has personal stories that are really powerful on their own and worth reading. Just those stories. And one of the stories that I want to highlight for you today is by a woman named Gloria. And let's look at just a couple of excerpts from her story. At age 67, I planned to retire in August 2013. My goal was to enjoy many spiritual activities that I couldn't while working. However, my retirement plans did not include the lung cancer found in a CT scan. Further tests confirmed tumors in both lungs and metastases in my brain and lymph nodes. My final diagnosis is gene mutation lung cancer for non-smokers. So we're going to talk today. This idea of rebuilding is difficult. It takes faith. It happens in stages with resistance. We're in this series called Rebuild, and one of the things we're saying is that God calls us to play small roles in the big things that he's doing. But when we say small, we don't mean insignificant. It's terribly significant that we get a role in God's story. So we'll talk about that as we go. But again, we need risk, faithful risk to make it happen. We'll say it this way. The same God that allows the walls to be broken down in our lives is the same God that desires to help us rebuild them. It's God's calling card. It's what he does. He is in the business of helping us build, for whatever reason, allowing our walls to be infiltrated and broken down at certain places in our lives, and then is in the business of helping us rebuild if we choose to, over and over. Our God has an eye for restoration and renovation. And we're saying that something happens here in those moments where he allows our walls to be infiltrated or broken down. It's there where something special happens that maybe can't happen anywhere else, where we've reached the end of ourselves, our ability to run or control our lives, is when God often steps in and does his best work. Well, as Pastor Nate said last week, Ezra and Nehemiah are one big piece of literature and are meant to be read that way, and it spans quite a bit over 100 years. And to summarize it, it happens in about 3 different waves. If we can look at the next slide. The first wave is that Zerubbabel leads exiles back to Jerusalem. Not everybody, not all the Jews came back, but some of them did, back to Jerusalem to rebuild their homes and the temple. And the second one is Ezra comes and he rebuilds the people spiritually. Yes, he takes part in rebuilding the walls and the city and other things. There's some resistance there, but ultimately Ezra is there to teach them and call them to obey the law of Moses. So it's this spiritual rebuilding more so. And then the last one is Nehemiah comes about 12 or 13 years after, and he leads the people to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and then also restore them as God's holy nation, calling them again back to God's law. So this plays out in, about 3 main waves, and it's the process of rebuilding, and it happens in stages, and there are setbacks, and the Israelites' neighbors don't want them to be successful. They want them to be controlled. They don't want them to rebuild. And by the time the Israelites are done with certain stages, it's good, but it's not. It feels like, is this really God's blessing? Because we're not near as powerful as we used to be, and we're still under the control of the Persians. And yet, we have this opportunity to walk with God, to rebuild with Him, with new eyes of faith, to do something brand new. The theme of this morning is found in the second half of verse 8 in Nehemiah, and Nehemiah says this: because the gracious hand of my God was on me. Because the gracious hand of my God was on me, I was able to go forward, take risks, to go forward in faith, because I believed that God was in this, and He was moving, and I wanted to be part of it. My will and God's will aligned on this one. My heart was broken in the same way God's was broken. So we're going to define this gracious hand of God for a moment, and we're going to say it this way. It's God's undeserved, sovereign, in control, intervention on behalf of those who seek Him. So when you see, metaphorically, of course, He can bring punishment, but also, like here, He's bringing goodness, and He's bringing undeserved favor, and it's His gracious blessing. And you might be sitting here this morning, and you might say, I don't feel it. Ben, I don't feel that gracious hand of God. I don't see it, or I haven't seen it in a long time. I'm still waiting. Ben, why hasn't the gracious hand of God worked in my life in that way? And that's a really good question. I don't want to give a flippant answer to that. I want to start by answering that question with a few questions of my own. For us, one of them is, are we even seeking God? Are we seeking His best in the first place? Are we looking for Him where He might be working and what He might be wanting to do, especially in areas of messiness in our lives and brokenness? Are we preparing our hearts for Him to actually do something? Because if you're anything like me, we have these like preset interpretations for what God's doing or not doing. And we don't even know we're necessarily doing it, but it's something like, if God allows me to lose my job or my career path or my health or this key relationship, obviously He's turned His back on me. Obviously He's punishing me. He wants nothing to do with me. I'm crying out. He's not hearing me. I don't even know that He exists at all. We go down that path, and even as believers, sometimes we get pretty far down that path because we have these preset interpretations that God couldn't possibly be working in this. His hand of protection is taken off of me, and so that's the beginning of the end. Unless He makes it right, I have to just kind of sit there and wait and just suffer. And yet we see time and time again in Scripture, in these stories, and I know many of you, and I know that you're living, breathing examples of this. It's that He does His best work during these times. His hand of God, His gracious hand may be on us more, even though we may not feel it at the time. In these particular times of difficulty. We'll say it this way: God's gracious hand can be upon us even in the midst of great difficulty. I might say, especially in the midst of great difficulty, we can experience the graciousness, the goodness, the guidance, the providence, the working of God in the midst of difficulty. Fast forward with me and think of Jesus and listen to His voice. Blessed are those that mourn. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they will see God. Blessed are you when you're persecuted. Jesus is announcing blessing on those of us that are in a state of mourning over a broken world and crying out over our desperate need for God and are persecuted for specifically Jesus' name. We're blessed. Some of you are going through something difficult, and it might be because you're doing the right thing. Parents, you might be experiencing horrible tension from your children because you're drawing good boundaries with them, and they're pushing back and they're fighting back against you. It might mean that you're doing the right thing, or it could just mean that we're just victims and products of a broken world. Let's look at another quote from Gloria, Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. Where has God been during this dark episode in my life? First, he was with me in the chance detection of cancer since I had no symptoms. Second, he has strengthened my faith in his plans for me without fear. Lung cancer is a silent invader. It attacks without warning through physical damage, but also in the fear of an unexpected shortening of life. But Jesus, the healing shepherd, has granted me a quiet peace through his gracious love. Nehemiah, our main character, is hundreds of miles east of Jerusalem, his homeland, his people. He's serving the king in a place called Susa, the Persian king. He gets news all the way in Susa that although Zerubbabel came in and helped them rebuild the temple and a little bit of the city, and Ezra came in and enhanced some of that and pointed them back to God, there was resistance. There was great resistance, and the work kind of stopped. And they stopped rebuilding the city, God's city in Jerusalem. And so, as Nate talked about last week, that made Nehemiah grieve deeply for somewhere between 3 and 4 months. His heart was broken for his people. And he probably wasn't around the king during this time, but the king of Persia, but if he was, he wasn't showing him that he was sad and grieving until our story this morning. He says in the end of chapter 1, he was the cupbearer, and the cupbearer was no insignificant thing. They knew about wines. They were the taste testers to make sure that the king didn't get poisoned. They were trusted advisors to the king, and if you were in the presence of the king, you were supposed to be cheerful. You were supposed to be jovial because you were in the presence of greatness, and that's what it meant. And so if you were going to be sad in the presence of the king, your life could very well be in danger. Definitely your job, maybe even your life. As you read through the story, keep in mind that the king and Nehemiah were not buddies. They weren't bestest friends. Oh, what's wrong, buddy? I see that you're sad. So just keep that in mind. They weren't buddies. So Nehemiah is sad, and the king is going to notice in this instance, and we read in verse 2 of chapter 2, "So the king asked me, 'Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill?' This can be nothing but sadness of the heart." And I was very much afraid because the king saw me sad. Cupbearers weren't supposed to present as sad. Remember, Nehemiah is serving the king in Persia. He's hundreds of miles away. His people have been exiled. He was one of them. Some of them returned. They were still under the control, though, of the Persians. Their work was resisted and halted. This particular king, Artaxerxes, he halted and stopped the work on the city of Jerusalem, which is rising. It's raising this intensity. In Hebrew, this word sad has a range of meaning, which again, it doesn't necessarily mean, oh, you just look so sad, I feel so sorry for you. It could have been the king going, you're looking out of sorts. This is not how you're supposed to look. I noticed something's different. The king might have even been assigning bad motives, and if you're reading the story for the first time, we're curious. So Nehemiah is afraid, and we're going to say it this way. The goal isn't to get rid of fear. It's not to get rid of our fear, but it's to acknowledge that we are afraid in our lives as we experience brokenness and continue moving forward in faith. The goal is not to wait until we're not afraid anymore. The goal is not to have fear sabotage whatever it is that we're trying to do for God. The goal is to acknowledge that we're afraid and to make sure that it doesn't sabotage what we're doing. I'm afraid, but I'm continuing to move forward in faith. Nehemiah was grieving for 3 to 4 months. He was heartbroken. And we read this in verse 3. "But I said to the king, 'May the king live forever,'" right? He's the cupbearer. He's following protocol. He's in the presence of the king. "Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" Now, the king could have said, "Who do you think you are talking to me that way? Who do you think you are? You are completely out of place in what you're saying." The king could have said that. Notice that Nehemiah is using very specific language. He's not saying to the king, "You're the one that stopped the work like 20 years ago. Jerusalem could have been a lot better, and I blame you. He's not saying that because I think he valued his life, right? So he's using specific language. The city, my ancestors are buried. In the ancient Near East, there was a common compassion and understanding about burial, about location of ancestors. And Nehemiah is saying, this is my problem. These are my people. He's being very tactful with his language because, again, he's talking to the king, and the king had all the power. Next verse, verse 4. The king said to me, what is it that you want? Then we see Nehemiah saying, then I prayed. You get the sense that for 3 or 4 months, he was in regular prayer, but now God's moving in this specific way, and the king is saying, what do you want? And Nehemiah is going to make sure that he prays to God before he says the next thing. So he prays. So again, it seems like, as we're reading, that God seems to be moving. God's reputation had been damaged, at least on the surface, because what kind of powerful God would allow his people to be exiled, his temple and city to be destroyed, the temple where he said that he dwelled? So his reputation is damaged, and yet we see this God in full control. Daniel says he sets up kings and deposes them. The Persian king is just a pawn in God's story. Nehemiah was completely dependent on God, but yet you don't see him just sitting on his hands. He's using that knowledge of dependence to act, to risk in the presence of the king. He's moving with God. His heart has broken with God, and he is moving with him forward in faith. The time for grieving is over, and the time for moving is now. But first, he prayed. And then I wonder what he's going to say next. Verse 5. And I answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah, hundreds of miles away, where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it. It's time. It's time to move. It's time to rebuild. It's time to risk. What is Nehemiah's motive for taking such a huge risk, for leaning into such an enormous project? And his motive is his heart is broken. You know those cruelty to animals commercials? I'm not making fun of this, by the way. Those cruelty to animal commercials where Sarah McLachlan's voice comes on, I will remember you. And it shows the animals shivering out in the cold. If I watched that for more than 30 seconds, Joe would come home to about 12 animals. And I don't even like animals, really. I mean, I like them. As long as they're your animals and I can visit them and leave, I like them. But we don't have any pets. I'm a little bit kind of annoyed. I know I had a bad experience with my cat, right? We're not going to get all into that. But there's because they know what they're doing. They're trying to break your heart in a million pieces and leave you like a puddle on the floor so that you'll respond, right? Can't get through that end of that Sarah McLachlan song. I'm just going to be giving my money away. Take it, all of it. His motive was a broken heart. And too often, I think, instead of aligning our hearts with God's or allowing our hearts to break with his and to move with his, unfortunately, we flip it. And we try to get God to align with what we want, with our dreams and our desires. Even as Christians, I think sometimes we flip it or we get it backwards. And we work from the opposite point. So as long as, God, you're giving me this, and as long as you're doing this, and as long as you're protecting me, as long as you're fulfilling your end of the bargain, or holding up your end of the bargain, then I will do this. I think oftentimes, if we're being honest, we flip it. We have it in reverse. Question is, where's your heart breaking? Where is it breaking? Whether you're talking about you, your family, your loved ones, something ill in our world, in our society, where is your heart breaking? Is it aligned with God? I'll tell you that one of the reasons that I'm involved the way that I am at North Kent Connect is because the staff there has caused my heart to break. and my heart to become very tender and compassionate and compelled by their vision of taking people that are struggling and giving them a hand up versus a hand out. It's compelling. It breaks my heart. It energizes me. Where's your heart breaking? Is it aligned with God? Are you grieving the ill in our world, in your family, with you? Are you sensing that he's asking you to take a step toward rebuilding, a step of risk? Maybe it's your finances, and you might say, my finances are in ruin and I'm so ashamed, or our finances are as a family. But I feel like God is asking us to take a step toward rebuilding, and it's hard. It's the hardest thing to take that first step. Or a job. My career path has dried up, and I've just been floundering, and I've been so depressed, and yet I sense that God is asking me to get up and to move forward. In my broken marriage, we're holding on by a thread. We're empty nesters and realize we have no connection, and I sense that God is moving or wanting to do something. I'm allowing my heart to break for the lack of connection in my marriage and to potentially move with God. Maybe it's post-marriage, maybe it's divorce, and maybe you sense that God is moving in the midst of all of the brokenness from the abuse that maybe you even had to endure the verbal abuse or physical, that God, you sense that he's moving and he's asking you to start to rebuild, and we're having trouble having children, and that there's been miscarriages, and we just sense that God is calling us to try again, even though some people are like, be careful, there's a whole lot of heartache on the other end of that. And yet we sense that God is asking us to try again, or to potentially adopt, or whatever it is. Or I've had church hurt in my recent history. Maybe my family did. We've been wounded, maybe by people in leadership, unfortunately. And yet we believe that God is calling us to take a step of rebuilding, trying out another church, even though we have PTSD. Complex PTSD is CPTSD. I call it church PTSD. CPTSD, right? We have that, and yet God's doing something. A disease that's destroying my body and just throwing me completely off kilter, and yet I sense God is doing something. I had an awesome opportunity on Friday. My cousin Zach and I have gotten close lately. We've rekindled our relationship. We were close in our childhood, and he always had heart issues. I know his story. Later in life, he had a pacemaker put in, two of them, and then a heart valve replacement, and they thought they had it under control. Well, just recently, he found out that he needed a new heart, and he's only 46 years old, okay? And so it's hard to explain, but Friday, he FaceTimed me, and he wanted me to pray with him. And so we're not even talking about rebuilding right now, because his whole world has been shattered, right, into a million pieces. It's been rocked. He's in Florida awaiting a new heart, came to find out that the heart they had for him was a little bit defective. The surgeon didn't like it, so now he's waiting again. But my point is, he FaceTimed me because he wanted me to pray with him. I've never prayed. Up until a couple of months ago, I've never prayed with my cousin Zach. And I'm just telling you, I sense that God is doing something in the midst of that. And it's not just what he's doing in my heart, drawing me closer to my cousin. It's what he's doing in my cousin's life. I sense it. It's very clear to me. Well, our text tells us that the queen is there with the king, which probably tells us one of a couple things. She liked Nehemiah, or it was a private meeting, because the queen didn't usually show up to public banquets. And the king says to Nehemiah, how long is your journey going to take, and when are you going to return? And so Nehemiah says, you can read this in the story later. I don't have all the verses for you, but he says, I set a time because it pleased the king for me to do it. And he's probably going to go back and forth, even though it was a long distance, a few different times. Nehemiah continues to take risks, and these verses are not on the screen for you, but he continues in the story. He asks the king for more. He says, hey, can I have some letters with the official king insignia on it, so that I can guarantee safe passage? And can I have a specific letter to the keeper and the leader of the forest, because they have timber that I need that we could use as resources to help rebuild the walls and our homes. Can I have that, king? So he he's all in, right? Nehemiah's all in. And then in verse 8, we're back to our theme for this morning, and we read this. And because the gracious hand of God was on me, the king granted my requests. He granted all of his requests. Nehemiah sensed that God was in this. He gave God credit for the movement that was happening, that God was speaking and moving his pawn, the king of Persia. In the middle of the mess of the Israelites, of Nehemiah's mess, of our mess, are we open to God working? Are we looking for evidence that God is working? Are we wanting him to and inviting him into it? Are we expecting that he is already because he does his best work during those times? We're talking about a God that banished the Israelites because of their rebellion. He banished them to the desert for 40 years of wandering, and then he went with them. And so we think, well, this is the beginning of the end. This was the beginning of God completely detaching from them, and yet we see God going with them. A cloud by day, a pillar of fire by night. The tabernacle set up where God was going to dwell in the midst of his broken people. And of course the Israelites rebelled again, and God allowed them to go into exile, and on and on and on it went. But can we just pause for a second and say it this way? It's better to have God's gracious hand on us while we struggle than it is to not have his gracious hand on us and prosper. It's better to have God's gracious hand on us in the midst of our struggle than it is to not have God's gracious hand on us in the midst of success or thriving. I think we know this. If God's not in it, what does it matter? What does it matter? What does all the success in the world matter? Because it's going to be taken from you and me anyway. But what does it matter? What significance does it have? Moses knew this, and God's so sick of his people at this point, and I think he's also testing Moses because he's God, and Moses is their leader, but he says, go ahead, just go. Just go into the land, have all my blessings, I'm just not going with you. And Moses goes, what? God says, yeah, I'm not going with you. You guys make me sick. And Moses goes, if you don't go with us, it doesn't mean anything. I'm not moving without you. We won't move without you. We won't move without you, right? We sing about this on purpose even, right? See, if God has to do X or Y for us to continue worshiping him and drawing close to him, then we just got to face the fact that we are not ultimately worshiping God as God. We're worshiping him as a means to our end. We're worshiping him for something that he can help provide, like success or comfort or whatever it is. To have it, to keep it. Well, the king, we see in our text, goes above and beyond, and he grants Nehemiah even some in verse 10. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. These are important characters that are going to come back up, and they're going to try to get in the way of what God and Nehemiah and the Israelites are doing. They're going to try to get in the way and put a stop to the rebuilding. Sanballat was the governor probably of Samaria to the north of Israel. There's a huge history between the Samaritans and the Jews, but he was somehow this caretaker of Jerusalem, even though, again, the Persians were in charge, right? The Persians were in control of everyone. The Horonite means somewhere north of Jerusalem. Tobiah had a Jewish name. He's going to come up as connected to the Jews. He was at least half Jewish, and so there's that. So he was kind of close. He had an in to the Jews, and he's going to try to use that to stop their progress. Ammonite means east. Samaria north, Ammonite east. And they weren't happy that someone was seeking the good of Israel. And you might be sitting there going, okay, I know you already took us through this, but I thought that once God starts moving and his gracious hand was on Nehemiah, that even though they went through difficulty, now it's only going to go well, because now this is a season of blessing, and only things are going to go well for Nehemiah and the people, and for me. So yeah, okay, fine, Ben. Difficulty happened, that season's over, and now we're in a season of blessing, right? I'm not saying you're not in a season of blessing. I'm just saying it's not quite that clean, because the truth is, whenever you and I set out to rebuild, we have to expect resistance. And this resistance is internal and external. We live in a broken world, but we also have broken hearts. And so internally, I don't know about you, but I'm my own worst enemy. When I set out to exercise faith in God and to rebuild my life for His honor and His glory, I'm met with internal resistance. Who do you think you are? You think you're going to be able to achieve that? Really? You think anybody's going to want you as you try to rebuild your career? You think your spouse is going to be responsive if you reach out to her in love and an invitation? You think your kids are going to be responsive to you as a mom or a dad if you try to say you're sorry and own it and move forward differently? Do you actually think that you have anything to offer? Our inner critic is strong, and Satan just uses all of that. The internal resistance is enough, let alone the external. And yet, are we able to grab a hold of Jesus' voice in the midst of that? Are we able to go, yeah, I don't have power on my own to make these changes. But if God's gracious hand is on me, He can accomplish anything. It's not about what I can do and what I can't do. It's about what God can do if I lean in, if I surrender this to Him, if I look for Him, if I join Him, if I align with Him, if my heart breaks with Him and moves with Him. But we have to expect complications. Walking with God through pain and suffering, glorious story continues. And we read this: since the initial chemotherapy led to a total shrinkage of brain tumors early on, I began to yearn for the same result in my lungs. But after 9 months of additional treatment, there's no sign of shrinkage in the tumors in my lungs. Containment is now the strategy. Waiting for the results of a CT scan every 3 months will become my new normal. We have to expect resistance, and yet we believe that we serve a God that's with us in our pain. He won't waste our pain, and He does His best work in our pain. How do you know that, Ben? Are you just talking? No, I know it. I think most of you do too. John chapter 6, Jesus is on earth, and He says this about Himself: for I have come down from heaven not to do my will, but to do the will of Him who sent me. And this is the will of Him who sent me, that I shall lose none of all those He's given me, but raise them up at the last day. For my Father's will is that everyone who looks to the Son and believes in Him shall have eternal life, and I will raise them up at the last day. We'll say it this way: Jesus is the ultimate Nehemiah, who left the glory and safety of His palace to die for our sins so that we might become citizens of His eternal city. This is what we're talking about. Jesus was the better Nehemiah because Jesus wasn't the cupbearer. Jesus was the king of the universe. And He plunged Himself into a broken world, into danger, to identify with us. And we know, because Jesus was perfect, He was the best person that's ever lived, that God's gracious hand was on Him. And because God's gracious hand was on Jesus, everything went well for Jesus, right? Wrong. He lived a horribly difficult life. The Spirit dragged Jesus into the desert to be tempted, and the Spirit catapulted Jesus to the Garden of Gethsemane, where He sweat drops of blood. And God catapulted and dragged Jesus to the cross. Dragged is probably the wrong word, because Jesus was willing to go. And yet we have this powerful language that because Jesus is obedient, He was led there. And on the cross, it looked like Jesus had been cursed. But the opposite was true. God's gracious hand was upon Him all the time. This is exactly what He was supposed to be doing. He used His love for us, for the joy set before Him. He endured the cross. He used His power not to get Himself off the cross and take care of Himself, but to stay the course and finish His mission. And if you and I have Jesus, we can know that God's gracious hand is on us. How do I know that God's gracious hand is on me, Ben? Do you have Jesus? Yes, then you know. Do you have faith in Jesus? Have you trusted in him? Then you know. If you have Jesus, you can know that God is pleased with you. You don't have to guess. If you have Jesus, you can be sad, mad, happy, glad in the presence of Jesus, and you're safe. You don't have to fear for your life like Nehemiah. We can be anything in his presence. And if we understand about Jesus, he becomes beautiful to us. The end of us is the beginning of a deeper relationship with him. And of course, Jesus then enlists us into his kingdom work, where we are to build his kingdom with him, where he gives us that awesome opportunity to give sneak previews of the coming eternal kingdom of Jesus and invite people into that. And of course, he's renewing us and changing us inside out along the way. Final quote from the Keller book. What I experienced was not physical pain, but misery in the soul. But once again, God reached out to me with an invitation from Proverbs 3:5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not unto your own understanding. That trust in Jesus required a further total and absolute surrender to his will on a continual basis. Because of God's profound mercy, I began to see my submission in terms of a greater participation with Christ in his suffering on the cross and his absolute submission to self, to the Most High. Last slide, let me just maybe show you how it works as we think about what it looks like to take a step in this direction. Where is your heart currently breaking? Where is it currently breaking? For yourself, for loved ones, for our world, our community? Does it align with God's heart? Is it self-pity where I'm just feeling sorry for myself because I compare myself to you and you have it so much easier than me? Or is my heart truly breaking for something that's going on in my life or my loved one's life or my community or my world? If so, assume God's already at work. He's already there, he's already present, and he's already working even if you can't notice it. Commit to taking a step of rebuilding. And as you do, continue to listen and look for God there, because he is. God, we are inviting you into the mess. I know you. I know many of you, and I know that you are living this or you have lived this. God, what step of faith and risk are you asking me to take here? I know you have an eye for renovation and restoration. I know you're in this because my heart is broken and your heart is broken, and I just want to move with you, and I want you to work in this very space that I prayed months ago that I would never be in, but now I'm changing my prayer. I want to look for you. I want to surrender this space to you and invite you in, and I look forward to seeing what you can do in the middle of my mess.